The sky over the North Atlantic is gray and freezing. It is 1985. High above the clouds, a formation of Soviet Tu-22 Backfire bombers is racing south at supersonic speed. They are the hammer of the Soviet Navy. Their mission is to hunt down and sink a United States aircraft carrier group. Inside the lead bomber, the pilot feels invincible. He is not alone. He is part of a regiment-strength raid. Dozens of bombers are flying with him. They are carrying massive Tu-22 anti-ship missiles designed to break the back of a supercarrier. The Soviet doctrine is simple mass. They believe that if they launch enough missiles at once, the American defenses will be overwhelmed. They will saturate the sky with death. The pilot checks his radar. It is clear. He is 100 miles away from the American fleet. He calculates that he is safe. The American fighters he believes cannot touch him at this range. Suddenly a light flashes on his dashboard. It is not a normal radar warning. It is a continuous high-pitched tone that he has never heard before. "Launch warning!" his weapons officer screams. "Multiple launches!" The pilot looks out of his cockpit window. The sky is empty. There are no enemy jets, no smoke trails, nothing. But the computer is screaming that he is dying. 100 miles away, unseen and untouched, an American fighter pilot has just pressed a single red button. 6 trails of white smoke erupt from beneath the wings of a large twin-engine fighter. The missiles climb rapidly into the stratosphere, arching over the curvature of the Earth. They are flying at Mach 5. They are the size of telephone poles. In the Soviet cockpit, panic sets in. The pilot tries to turn. He tries to dive. But the missiles are coming from above, guided by an active radar seeker that cannot be jammed. One by one, the Tu-22 bombers begin to explode. They are being swatted from the sky like flies long before they could even fire their own weapons. The swarm has flown into a wall. The Soviet pilot dies with a question on his lips. Where are they? The answer is the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. And the weapon that killed him was the AIM-54 Phoenix. This was the nightmare scenario that kept Soviet admirals awake at night. This was the machine that turned their saturation attack doctrine into a suicide pact. To understand why the F-14 was such a shock, we have to go back to the briefing rooms of Moscow in the 1970s. Back to the moment when the Soviet High Command looked at the American aircraft carrier and laughed. For decades, the Soviet Union viewed the U.S. Navy's supercarriers not as threats, but as targets. Floating coffins, they called them. Massive, expensive, and impossible to miss. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the father of the modern Soviet Navy, had built a strategy designed to exploit this. He knew he couldn't build carriers to match the Americans, so he built carrier killers. He built submarines with cruise missiles. He built cruisers bristling with rockets. And most importantly, he built the naval aviation regiments. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. In the event of war, the Soviet Navy would launch everything it had at the American carriers. They would launch hundreds of missiles simultaneously. The Americans have excellent fighters, the Soviet analysts admitted. The F-4 Phantom is a good plane, but it can only shoot at one target at a time. It carries 4 radar missiles. If we send 50 bombers and the Americans have 2 fighters on patrol, they can shoot down 8. The other 42 will get through. It was a math problem, and the math was on the side of the Soviets. They believed the Americans were stuck in the past, obsessed with dogfighting, trying to build agile fighters to turn and burn. They believed the Americans didn't understand the new reality of missile warfare. So they built the Tu-22 Backfire, a beautiful swing-wing bomber capable of Mach 2. It was designed to sprint towards the carrier group, launch its missiles from 200 miles away, and run home before the American fighters could even catch it. It was a perfect plan, on paper. But while the Soviets were perfecting the art of the swarm, the Americans were secretly rewriting the laws of aerial combat. The U.S. Navy knew about the swarm. They knew the math, too. And they knew the F-4 Phantom was not enough. They needed a new kind of fighter. not a dogfighter, not a MiG killer. They needed a fleet defender. They needed a machine that could stand guard hundreds of miles away from the carrier alone and fight an entire army by itself. The result was the F-14 Tomcat. When the first intelligence photos of the F-14 reached Moscow, the reaction was mixed. They saw a large, heavy aircraft. It had swing wings just like their Backfire bomber. It had 2 crew members. "It is too big," the Soviet experts said. "It will be a clumsy cow in the air. It is too expensive. The Americans will bankrupt themselves building it." They laughed at the complexity. The F-14 was packed with the most advanced electronics of the 1970s. The Soviets, struggling with their own vacuum tube technology, believed such a complex machine would never work in combat. The radar will fail, they predicted. The maintenance will be a nightmare. But what they failed to understand was the purpose of the complexity. The heart of the F-14 was not its engines or its wings. It was the AWG-9 radar. To the Soviet mind, a fighter radar was a flashlight. It pointed where the nose pointed. It could see one thing at a time. The AWG-9 was not a flashlight. It was a lighthouse. It was the most powerful radar ever put into a fighter jet. It had a detection range of over 200 miles, but its true superpower was track while scan. The AWG-9 could track 24 separate targets simultaneously. Think about that number, 24. An F-14 pilot and his Rio radar intercept officer could look at their screens and see an entire Soviet bomber regiment. The computer would analyze each target. It would calculate their speed, their heading, and their threat level. It would then prioritize the 6 most dangerous targets, and then it would do the impossible. It would fire 6 missiles at 6 different targets at the same time. This was science fiction to the Soviets. Their own fighters, like the MiG-23 or the MiG-25, could barely lock onto one target in a clutter-free environment. The idea that a single American plane could engage a squadron, it broke their math. The missile itself, the AIM-54 Phoenix, was the other half of the equation. It was a monster, 13 feet long, half a ton in weight. It cost $500,000 a shot. It was the most expensive air-to-air missile ever made. And it was the only missile in the world that had its own radar brain. When the F-14 fired a Phoenix, the missile would climb to 100,000 feet near the edge of space. It would fly at Mach 5. It would trade its kinetic energy for range. As it plunged down on its target, it would turn on its own internal radar. It became a pit bull. The F-14 could turn away and leave. The missile would finish the job. The Soviets had laughed at the F-14's size. They didn't realize that it had to be big to carry these massive missiles. It wasn't a fighter jet in the traditional sense. It was a flying missile battery. But the arrogance of the Soviet high command was stubborn. They refused to believe the American claims. "Propaganda," they said again. "No radar can track 24 targets. No computer is that smart. It is a bluff." They continued to build their Backfire bombers. They continued to train their pilots to fly in tight formations, relying on safety in numbers. They believed that if they just sent enough planes, the F-14s would run out of missiles or the radar would get confused. They were betting the lives of their pilots on the assumption that American technology was a lie. This set the stage for one of the most dramatic demonstrations of military power in history. A test that was designed specifically to shut the mouths of the doubters, both in Moscow and in Washington. The Americans knew the Soviets were watching. They decided to put on a show. It was called the 6-on-6 test. The date was November 22, 1973. The location was Point Mugu, California, overlooking the vast Pacific Missile Test Range. The atmosphere in the control room was tense. American admirals and congressional aides were watching the screens. But they weren't the only ones interested. Across the world, intelligence analysts in Moscow were waiting for the signal intercept. The U.S. Navy was about to attempt something that had never been done in the history of warfare. High above the ocean, an F-14 Tomcat call sign, Galley 201, was cruising at 25,000 feet. 40 miles away, 6 target drones were launched. They were T-38 Talons and QF-86 Sabres modified to look like Soviet bombers on radar. This was not an easy test. It was a torture test. The drones were not flying in a polite formation. They were simulating a chaotic saturation attack. Some were flying high at Mach 1.2. Others were flying low, skimming the waves. They were spreading out. And to make it even harder, they were blasting electronic jamming signals trying to blind the Tomcat's radar. In a Soviet briefing room, this scenario would be considered a guaranteed kill for the attackers. One fighter against 6 jamming targets coming from different angles, impossible. Inside the F-14, the radar intercept officer, or RIO, buried his face in the radar scope. His hands flew across the controls. The AWG-9 radar didn't panic. It didn't get confused. It simply worked. On the RIO screen, 6 symbols appeared. The computer assigned a priority number to each one. It calculated the launch order. System ready. The pilot pulled the trigger. Whoosh! A Phoenix missile dropped from the belly, ignited its rocket motor, and roared into the sky. 3 seconds later, whoosh! Another one. Then another. In just 38 seconds, the F-14 fired all 6 of its Phoenix missiles. The sky was filled with white smoke trails. To an observer, it looked like the F-14 was emptying its magazine in a panic. But the missiles weren't flying blindly. They were on rails. The first missile climbed to 100,000 feet, arcing over the stratosphere. It looked down, saw the jamming signal of the lead drone, and dove. Impact! The first drone disintegrated. Seconds later, the second drone exploded. Then the third. Then the fourth. 4 direct hits. 1 missile suffered a hardware failure. 1 passed within lethal distance of the target, technically a kill by proximity fuse standards, but the message was clear. 1 plane had engaged an entire squadron, and won. When the data from Point Mugu reached the Soviet Union, the laughter stopped. The clumsy cow had just done the impossible. The Soviet strategists pulled out their calculators again. But this time, the math was terrifying. An American aircraft carrier carried 2 squadrons of F-14s. That was 24 aircraft. If each F-14 could kill 6 bombers, that meant a single carrier air wing could theoretically destroy 144 incoming missiles or bombers in less than a minute. The saturation attack. The cornerstone of Soviet naval doctrine was dead. They couldn't build enough bombers to overwhelm the shield. If they sent a regiment of backfires, they would all die before they even saw the American fleet. The F-14 Tomcat had single-handedly rendered the Soviet naval aviation branch obsolete. But the Soviets, being Soviets, were skeptical. A test range is not a wartime, they argued. The Americans rigged the test. The drones didn't fight back. In a real dogfight against our agile MiGs, the big heavy Tomcat will be a sitting duck. They believed that the F-14 was a missile truck, dangerous at long range, but helpless in a knife fight. They were wrong about that too, and they would find out just how wrong they were, not in the cold Atlantic, but in the burning deserts of the Middle East. The Iran-Iraq War. This is the forgotten chapter of the Cold War, where American and Soviet technology clashed head-on for 8 brutal years. Before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the United States had sold 79 F-14 Tomcats to the Shah of Iran. When the Shah fell and the new regime took over, those Tomcats fell into the hands of the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force. The Soviets assumed that without American technicians and spare parts, the complex Tomcats would become useless hangar queens. They expected the Iraqi Air Force, equipped with the best Soviet fighters, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and the brand-new MiG-25 Foxbat, to dominate the skies. Saddam Hussein believed this too. He invaded Iran confident that his Soviet-trained Air Force would sweep the skies clear. He walked into a buzzsaw. The Iranian pilots, many of them trained in the U.S., kept their F-14s flying through cannibalization and sheer ingenuity. And when they took them up to meet the Iraqis, it was a slaughter. The first shock for the Soviet advisors in Baghdad was the range. Iraqi pilots flying MiG-23s would simply explode. No warning, no enemy seen. They would be flying on patrol 50 miles behind their own lines and suddenly boom. The AIM-54 Phoenix was not just a bomber killer, it was a sniper rifle. But the second shock was even worse. The clumsy F-14 could turn. The F-14 had a secret aerodynamic weapon, its swing wings, and its massive fuselage which generated lift. When the wings swept forward, the Tomcat had more wing area than a small jet. It could turn tight. It could fly slow. In one famous engagement, a lone F-14 was bounced by two Iraqi MiG-21s. The MiGs were small, agile, designed for dogfighting. The Soviet manuals said the F-14 should try to run. Instead, the Tomcat pilot turned into the fight. He used his massive engines to power through a vertical loop, got behind the MiGs, and shot them both down with Sidewinder missiles. The missile truck was a ninja. The statistics from the Iran-Iraq War are still debated, but the consensus is devastating for Soviet hardware. The F-14 Tomcat is credited with shooting down over 160 Iraqi aircraft during the war. It shot down MiG-21s. It shot down MiG-23s. It shot down Su-22s. And most humiliating of all, it shot down the MiG-25 Foxbat. The MiG-25 was the Soviet champion. It was the fastest plane in the world. It flew at Mach 3. The Soviets believed it was untouchable, but the F-14's radar didn't care about speed. The Phoenix missile flew at Mach 5. It simply ran the Foxbat down. There is a legend whispered among pilots about a specific Iranian ace named Jalil Zandi. He is the most successful F-14 pilot in history. He is credited with shooting down 11 Iraqi aircraft. He proved that in the hands of a skilled pilot, the American machine was not just superior, it was dominant. The psychological impact on the Iraqi Air Force and their Soviet advisors was profound. They developed a condition known as Tomcat phobia. It got so bad that the Iraqi pilots would turn around and flee the moment their radar warning receiver detected the specific frequency of the AWG-9 radar. They didn't wait to be shot at. The mere sound of the Tomcat looking at them was enough to make them abort the mission. The Soviet generals in Moscow read the reports with growing horror. Their best fighters, flown by combat-experienced pilots, were being swatted out of the sky by a plane that was supposedly too complex to fly and too heavy to fight. They realized that the F-14 was not just a weapon system. It was a technological generation gap. The Soviet radars were analog. They were easily jammed. They had blind spots. The American radar was digital. It was smart. It could burn through jamming. The Soviet missiles were semi-active, meaning the pilot had to keep his nose pointed at the enemy until impact. This made him vulnerable. The American Phoenix was active, fire and forget. The F-14 could kill you and be halfway home before you died. The humiliation reached its peak in the late 1980s. The Soviets eventually supplied Iraq with their newest, most advanced fighter, the MiG-29 Fulcrum. This was the plane designed specifically to beat the American F-15 and F-16. Surely the modern MiG-29 could defeat the old heavy F-14. It didn't. In the few engagements that occurred, the F-14s used their superior radar to detect the MiG's first maneuver into position and kill them before the MiG pilots even knew the fight had started. The 1 versus 6 capability was never fully used in a World War III scenario, thank God. But the threat of it changed the Cold War. Because the Soviets knew the F-14 worked, they had to change their entire naval strategy. They realized they couldn't get close to American carriers with aircraft, so they had to invest billions in massive long-range anti-ship cruise missiles like the Granite and Basalt fired from submarines. They were forced to abandon the sky because the Tomcat owned it. But the story of the F-14 has a final ironic twist, a twist that proves just how far ahead of its time it really was. In the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, the U.S. Navy decided to retire the F-14. It was expensive to maintain. The Dick Cheney defense cuts were looming. They replaced it with the F-18 Super Hornet. The F-18 is a good plane. It is modern, it is reliable, but it is slower than the Tomcat. It has a shorter range than the Tomcat, and for a long time it didn't have a missile that could match the range of the Phoenix. Many naval aviators argue that when the F-14 retired, the U.S. Navy actually took a step backward in raw capability. They gave up the long reach. Why? Because the threat was gone. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Tu-22 Backfire regiments were rusting on the tarmac. There was no longer a swarm to fight. The F-14 Tomcat had done its job too well. It had helped bankrupt the enemy and neutralize their strategy so completely that it made itself unemployed. It was the victim of its own success. There is one final aspect of the F-14 story that the Soviet generals never understood. And it wasn't about radars or missiles or turn rates. It was about the soul of the machine. In 1986, a movie was released that changed the public perception of the military forever. It was called Top Gun. To the Soviet propaganda machine, Top Gun was just a Hollywood lie, a recruitment poster. But to the pilots who flew the Tomcat, and to the adversaries who feared it, the movie captured a fundamental truth. The F-14 was not just a weapon. It was a predator. It had a personality. It was big, loud, dangerous, and undeniably charismatic. The Soviet Union built machines that were tools. The MiG-23 was a hammer. The Tu-22 was a sledgehammer. They were utilitarian, painted in drab gray or green with cockpits painted a sickening turquoise blue to keep pilots calm. They were built to be used and discarded. The F-14 was built to be mastered. The relationship between the pilot and the Rio radar intercept officer was unique. In a Soviet two-seat fighter, the backseater was often a subordinate or an instructor. In the F-14, they were a married couple. They thought as one. This human element was the software update that the Soviets couldn't steal. You could steal the blueprints for the swing wing. You could steal the frequency of the radar. But you couldn't steal the initiative of a 25-year-old American lieutenant who was trained to think for himself, to make split-second decisions at Mach 2, and to trust his wingman with his life. The Soviet doctrine relied on ground control. The pilot was a puppet guided by a general in a bunker. The American doctrine, perfected in the cockpit of the Tomcat, was independent action. The F-14 was the bunker. It was the AWACS. It carried its own command center on its back. This philosophical gap, centralized control versus distributed lethality, was the real reason the Soviet naval strategy collapsed. They realized that if they cut the communication links to their bombers, their pilots would be lost. But an F-14 crew cut off from the carrier would just keep fighting. They would just keep killing. The Soviets did try to respond. They were not blind. They saw the power of the long-range interceptor. In the early 1980s, they introduced the MiG-31 Foxhound. On paper, the Foxhound was a beast. It was fast. It had a massive, passive, electronically scanned array radar, the Zaslon, which was arguably even more advanced than the AWG-9 in some respects. It could fire long-range R-33 missiles, which looked suspiciously like the American Phoenix. The MiG-31 was the Soviet attempt to build a Tomcat, but it failed to change the game. Why? Because the MiG-31 was designed purely for defense. It was a goalie. It was designed to stay over Mother Russia and shoot down incoming cruise missiles. It lacked the range, the loiter time, and the carrier capability to project power. The F-14 was a forward player. It took the fight to the enemy's door. It allowed the U.S. Navy to park a carrier group off the coast of Murmansk or Vladivostok and say, "We are here, and you cannot touch us." The MiG-31 protected the homeland. The F-14 ruled the world's oceans. As the Cold War wound down in the late 80s and early 90s, the F-14 had one final evolution left. The Bombcat. The aircraft that was designed to kill bombers became a bomber itself. The engineers realized that the massive lifting body of the Tomcat designed to carry heavy missiles, could also carry heavy laser-guided bombs. So while the Soviet Air Force was rotting on the runways, unable to afford fuel, F-14s were flying over Iraq, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, dropping precision munitions with the same deadly accuracy they had used to track targets at Point Mugu 20 years earlier. It was the ultimate insult. The machine designed to fight World War III was now doing the mud-moving work of a ground attack plane simply because there was no one left in the sky to fight. The king had cleared the board. Now he was just cleaning up the pieces. But all reigns must come to an end. On September 22, 2006, at Naval Air Station Oceana, the last F-14 Tomcat took its final flight. It was a funeral for a legend. Grown men, admirals, and mechanics alike wept as the big fighters shut down their engines for the last time. Why was the retirement so emotional? Why do we still talk about the Tomcat today, almost 2 decades later? Because it was the last of its kind. The planes that replaced it, the F-18 Super Hornet, and later the F-35, are technological marvels. They are stealthy, they are networked, they are easier to maintain, but they are multi-role. They are jacks of all trades. The F-14 was a specialist. It was a thoroughbred. It was built for one specific, terrifying purpose: to fly into the face of the Soviet swarm and say, "Not today." It was built to protect the fleet at all costs. It was the shield of the Navy. And it never failed. Not once in its entire operational history did a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier come under successful attack from the air while the Tomcat was on watch. The Soviet generals who laughed in 1970 had predicted that the carrier was a dinosaur destined to be sunk by missiles. The F-14 proved them wrong. It proved that if you have the right technology and the right people, the defense can be stronger than the offense. The legacy of the Tomcat is not just in the movies, it is in the geopolitical map of the world today. The reason the United States can still project power anywhere on the globe, the reason the aircraft carrier remains the ultimate symbol of American strength, is because for 30 years the F-14 ensured that no one dared to challenge it. The Tomcat won the Cold War at sea without ever firing a Phoenix missile in anger against the Soviets. The threat was enough. The lock was enough. The laughter in Moscow had turned into a grudging, terrified respect. Today, somewhere in the deserts of Iran, a few ancient F-14s are still flying. They are kept alive by a regime that hates the country that built them. It is a supreme irony. Even the enemies of America cannot bear to let the Tomcat go. They know, just as the U.S. Navy knew, that there is simply nothing else like it. As we look back at the history of military aviation, there are many great planes: the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Phantom, the Eagle. But the Tomcat stands alone. It was the only plane that could take on an army by itself. It was the plane that made the Soviet Union blink. And for anyone who ever saw it launch from a catapult, wings swept back afterburners glowing like the eyes of a dragon, there is no doubt. The F-14 wasn't just a machine. It was the tangible, undeniable proof of a superpower's will to dominate the sky. The generals laughed, the Tomcat roared, and the rest is history.